Good morning, Barbados. Good afternoon, Geneva. A warm welcome to the second Ministerial Round table at UNCTAD 15. And the subject we're going to dive in for this session is reshaping global and regional value chains. It's a hugely important and very topical theme, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. My name is Nisha Pillay. In a moment, I'll be introducing you to our panelists, but first, may I invite all of you, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to feel really involved in this session. Please send in your questions and your comments. You can use our event chat function if you like. If you want, you can go by the old-fashioned method of simply sending us an email direct to the UNCTAD Secretariat. Let me give you the email address right away. It's diae.info@un.org. I'll repeat that, diae.info@un.org. And I do believe that we have a mechanism to allow people who are on the floor in Geneva, should they wish to put a question themselves, to simply raise their flag, and then the message will be sent to me so that I can draw you into the conversation a bit later in the meeting. So are we ready to get started? I'd like to introduce you now for our opening remarks to the new UNCTAD Secretary General, Ms. Rebecca Grinspan. The floor is yours, Ms. Grinspan.
Thank you so much, Nisha, and I must begin by thanking our distinguished panelists for joining us here today. I know, Nisha, that you will be in charge of introducing all of our panelists, but let me really thank them very specially for being here with us today. This Ministerial Roundtable is devoted to a very important subject in the context of this pandemic: the reshaping of regional and global value chains. Here, our panelists will discuss three key topics related to these questions. Namely, first, what is the current status of global and regional value chains? What was affecting them before the pandemic? And how has the pandemic changed them? Second, how will countries' recovery strategies reshape global and regional value chains? And third, and lastly, how is a reconfigured value chain map affect the development and investment community? How can we ourselves together prepare for this new paradigm? Now, before I yield the floor, I would like to share with you some of UNCTAD's thought on these issues as a way of setting the stage for the debate. It has been almost 2 years since the pandemic broke into human history, changing everyone's lives. The virus and the measures to contain it have left deep scars in the global economy, particularly the highly performing global value chain machine that boosted trade and investment for over 3 decades was broken with the pandemic. In 2020, international investment declined by 35% and trade by 5%. As highlighted by the year's UNCTAD World Investment Report, international investment reached its lowest value since 2005, almost 20% lower than in 2009, where we were in the midst of the financial crisis. Since then, international investment is back on a recovery path, and those are good news, with prospects for 2021 of 15% growth, according to our recent forecast. Very few of us, only a year ago, would have foreseen such a rapid rebound, but most of this recovery is happening in the developed world. For example, UNCTAD's SDG Investment Trend Monitor has reported a major fall in cross-border flows in sectors relevant for the SDGs, SDG-relevant greenfield investment in developing regions is now 35% lower than before the pandemic, and international project finance is down by 40%. So, concerns about where this recovery is taking place are very important for our analysis. Also, concerns about the fragility of global value chains remain. The pandemic exposed the faults of modern global value chains like never before. It uncovered failings in the international supply chains of health care equipment and medicines. It subsequently triggered supply chain problems in virtually all manufacturing industries, forcing, for example, car manufacturers in Europe to cut production due to acute chip shortages in East Asia. The effects of long COVID on global supply chains then are daunting. Shipping costs are still skyrocketing, growing about 5 times relative to pre-COVID and 3 times only in the last year, raising serious concerns over inflationary measures. We have heard from Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, the effect that that has had in food imports and food security in small island states. The crisis then of the global value chains is by no means solely caused by the pandemic. They were pre-existing challenges to the system of international production arising from 3 megatrends. First, the new industrial revolution, B, growing economic nationalism, and C, the sustainability imperative. As a result, we were already on a slow growth trend for international trade and investment throughout the 2010s. Cross-border investment in physical productive assets already stopped growing a decade ago. To meet challenges ahead, future trajectories of international production need to be supported by an open and inclusive global economic environment with resilient and well-functioning global value chains. If this crisis has taught us anything, it is that shocks should not shock us any longer, and that the word resilience has to be part of our development strategies all the time, in our strategies to achieve the SDGs. In this respect, we see several trends. First, reshoring and/or nearshoring, implying a move towards some form of economic deglobalization, remains a question mark. It is unclear whether reshored global value chains are more resilient. That's an open question. Second, a more realistic alternative to reshoring is diversification and redundancy, meaning a trajectory that leverages rather than dismantles global value chains. And this is to build resilience. As concentration of production and dependence are the main issues, companies and countries may find international diversification very effective. We see third trend. We see momentum for regionalization, a third trajectory for the evolution of the global value chains. It's also likely that regionalization will grow further in the coming years, including through progress on several regional integration initiatives. Policy pressures for regional strategic autonomy, business resilient considerations, and the public push for sustainability will lead global multinational enterprises to replicate value chains at the regional level, or otherwise will stimulate the growth of indigenous multinational enterprise by structuring their operations near shore. On the policy side, many countries could come to see regionalism as a realistic and valid alternative to both globalism and nationalism, and so, without entering into this polarized globalism and nationalism, build a degree of local self-reliance and resilience. In this context of diversification, regionalization, and reshoring, nearshoring, policymakers need to prepare for the many challenges and opportunities that will rise. Challenges include tougher competition for foreign direct investment, value captured in global value chains will become more difficult, as will be more difficult to have development-based vertical specialization. We also see industrial infrastructure built for a world of global value chains showing diminishing returns. Opportunities, very quickly. It will include attracting investors looking to diversify supply bases and building redundancy and resilience. The pool of regional markets seeking investments will increase. Shorter value chains may bring more investment in distributed manufacturing and final goods production with broader industrial capacity building and clustering. And digital infrastructure and platforms will improve bottom-up access to global value chains. Sustainability imperative will lead to more green and blue investments and value chains. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, these changes in the investment and global value chains development paths require new strategic policy thinking on what investment to attract, how to attract it, and how to ensure it delivers maximum development benefits. This is where UNCTAD plays an important role. Through our strategic advice in investment policy reviews, our tools to support investment promotion agencies, investment facilitation initiatives, and special economic zones. So, something very important, that is the capacity building that we do, such of what we do in program as Enterprise, that aim to strengthen local business participation and the impact of international investment. But we will not be alone in this transformation. Key leaders of the sector are with us in this Ministerial Roundtable, and I am very eager to hear their opinions and suggestions to these important matters, including what do you think UNCTAD should focus on and do for the future. To them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Greenspan, for that masterful overview of the way in which global value chains are being shaken up. Even the immediate future. Here are a few points that stuck with me from that speech of yours. The whole being broken by the pandemic. That made me sit up and think. SDG relevant investment is down by 35% since the start of the pandemic, and the fragility of value chains is evident in all industries. It really is a widespread problem. There are challenges and there are opportunities. The buzzwords right now are about reshoring and economic deglobalization. These are the Secretary General has laid before unpack in our panel discussion. Let me introduce you now to some of our panelists. Joining us from Uganda, we have His Excellency Dr. Mr. David Bahati, Minister of State for Industry. Welcome, Your Excellency. From the Federal Republic of Germany, we're joined by Her Excellency, Ms. Elisabeth Winkelmeyer-Becker, Parliamentary State Secretary from the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Welcome, Your Excellency. To give us a business perspective, we're joined by Mr. John Denton, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. And we're hoping to be joined shortly live from Abu Dhabi by a very senior government minister from the United Arab Emirates, His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Ali Al Shorafa Al Hammadi, but we're having a few technical issues connecting with him, which I'm sure will be resolved soon. Meantime, welcome panelists. May I ask you to pick up the gauntlet, please, of that challenge laid before us by Rebecca Greenspan. And first, perhaps I could call on Your Excellency, Mr. David Bahati from Uganda, to talk to us about the challenges and the opportunities you see in Uganda as the world is going through these tectonic shifts. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. The Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and my dear panelists, I want to commend the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development for organizing this particular ministerial panel discussion. As you recall, on our last 14th Ministerial Conference in Nairobi, we underscored the need to move from decision to action. And I'm glad that the discussion today is focusing on moving from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. And to do this, we need action. There are a few other critical aspects that we must address ourselves to. We cannot achieve prosperity for all in tandem with our theme without addressing dealing with the economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic with a view to increasing African participation in global trade, addressing the supply side constraints with a view to promote industrialization, including minimum beneficiation, leveraging on IT, e-commerce for trade, promotion and development, and access to affordable finance for development, and addressing gender disparities and gender-based discrimination. And of course, addressing the issue of climate change and global warming. And particularly in the fight against COVID-19, we must address the issue of access to vaccination. It is a shame that the rest of the world can be now talking about massive vaccination, while on our side, we have not even reached 7% vaccination. So let me pick out two issues that I think relate to what the Secretary General has touched on. One is the issue of self-reliance and self-resilience. What we have learned in this pandemic is that each country must be self-reliant and self-resilient. So increasing African participation in global trade, the current global trade of over 18 trillion, African contribution is less than 3%. So out of the 18 trillion US dollars, Africa only contributes 3%. For intra-Africa trade is less than 16% compared to intra of 67% in Europe and 58% in North America. Africa depends on the rest of the world in terms of supply of raw materials and market for its agro produce, including minerals. On average, Africa imports 554 billion as compared to exports of 451 billion, suggesting a deficit of over 100 billion. So these are issues that we must address. These are the opportunity challenges, but also they provide opportunities for investment. And we think that this organization working with you can actually help us address these issues. While considering the challenge of supply side constraints, logistics and trade related infrastructure, interconnectivity is still a matter. Opportunities to unlock the potential infrastructure, interconnectivity exist. African Development Bank estimates that 70 billion US dollars is needed per year. Addressing this issue is expected to promote African economic growth by over 6%, notably in areas of industrialization, intra-Africa growth, trade growth, employment, and especially of the young people. The second aspect, opportunity to have, is promotion of industrialization. That's value addition, including mineral beneficiation. African continent is sitting on more than 82 trillion US dollars of undiscovered natural resources, with a potential to contribute to over US dollar 30 billion of government revenue in the next 20 years. This is a particular area that we think, in a connection to what the Secretary General has raised, that we can tackle and handle to benefit the people of Africa. In the case of Uganda, there are several untapped reserves, including copper, limestone, iron ore, cobalt, platinum, and marble. Mineral beneficiation is critical for modern societies in Africa. The sector provides the potential in contributing sustainable development goals and contributing smart, sustainable, and decent economic growth, providing well-paid jobs, opportunities, especially in active economies and mineral industry. In conclusion, we must address the issue of equality in the fight against COVID by making sure that there is access to vaccination on the continent. We must also market the opportunities we have on the continent and attract direct investments to benefit the African continent. Let us work to ensure strengths across all links of the chain and to pursue equity in development. Mutually beneficial partnerships are important and should be encouraged. The institution must remain strong and focused in order to deliver us where we want to be. I thank you, Secretary General.
And we thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Bahati, for that call for action. Now, I wonder what the perspective is in one of the world's big manufacturing powerhouses, the Federal Republic of Germany. Let's cross over now to Berlin and see how these opportunities and challenges of reshoring are viewed by Her Excellency, Ms. Elisabeth Winkelmeyer-Becker. Over to you, Your Excellency. Your Excellency, we can't hear you. Your mic, I think, needs to be unmuted. Could you possibly sort that out or ask someone to assist you with that, please, Your Excellency?
Yes, I did it.
Excellent.
Excellencies and delegates, the international community is facing global challenges, and that requires global solutions. And for this reason, international cooperation is more important than ever. And this conference, UNCTAD 15, offers an excellent forum for this. So thank you for inviting me. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a severe impact on all countries around the world. It has revealed weaknesses which we urgently need to address in the international community. If the recovery is to be more equal, it will be important to substantially improve the supply of vaccines to poorer countries. This is an important issue to Germany. In order to facilitate a just and efficient distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, Germany will provide the total of 100 million doses of vaccine to poorer countries. Ambition and close cooperation is needed not only in the fight against the pandemic, but also in the field of international trade. Global trade offers great opportunities for economic growth and employment. A central role here is played by foreign direct investment. It generates local value creation and jobs. It facilitates technology transfer and local economic prospects, especially in the countries of the global south, which have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. The global crisis offers the opportunity to make our lives and our economic activity more sustainable. There's no doubt at all we need to implement the Agenda 2030 more quickly. A key priority is to better integrate developing countries into the global economy. Developing countries need private sector inward investment on their path to attaining the development targets. For this reason, Germany supports the plurilateral WTO initiative for investment facilitation. Also, we have been successfully using the instrument of investment guarantees for many years to support investments by German companies in developing countries. Global value chains have become a dominant feature of world trade in recent decades. Our issue must be that the developing countries actually benefit from the global distribution of production, that added value is shared fairly and increasingly takes place there. Developing countries must not just be the cheap workbench of the industrialized countries. Governments can boost the resilience of the existing value chains by providing a suitable and stable environment that allows companies to plan ahead. This includes legal certainty in international trade, which can be fostered by a strengthening of the WTO. Germany supports the work of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. The WTO and the UNCTAD are working together on this important issue. The proportion of internationally active companies, which both import and export, stands at about 27% in Germany. But in terms of the volume of trade, more than 95% of total German trade in goods is generated by companies which both import and export. In many manufacturing sectors, in fact, the figure is close to 100%. Imported upstream products from abroad thus play a key role for Germany's export industry and make a crucial contribution to its competitiveness. I'm firmly convinced that the upholding of open markets in combination with a rule-based trading system is vital for growth and resilience in today's connected economies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Elizabeth Winkelmeyer. Becca, I've been taking notes of what the points you made, and we will have follow-up questions shortly. But first, let's get a business perspective now. I'd like to bring into the conversation John Denton, the president of the International Chamber of Commerce, to tell us a little bit about how he sees not just the challenges of the reshoring that we've been hearing about. We've heard about a lot of challenges to value chains in the course of the pandemic, but what might the possible opportunities be? And I know we're going to get some interesting answers from Mr. Denton, because I've had the pleasure of working with him before in 2018 at the World Investment Forum then. So welcome, John. What are your thoughts?
First of all, thank you very much, and allow me to give a big shout out to Rebecca. I had the pleasure of working with Rebecca very closely when she was running SEGIB, or the Ibero-American States, in Madrid. And I can only tell you, one reason I like working with Rebecca is she actually likes dealing with the private sector. And that's a very welcome quality to have in a leadership role at the United Nations, given that the Secretary General himself, in his recently released paper about rethinking effectively multilateralism, really only paid passing regard to the role of the private sector, and the fact that at UNCTAD, the role of the private sector as probably the most functional part of the global economy. Let's face it, the private sector cooperates and functions, partly because it needs to, but partly because that's just the way we are, is actually probably a good indicator of what the quality is that needs to be focused on for successful multilateralism in the future. And the reality is the multilateralism in the 21st century can only be delivered and effective with a full-on engagement of the private sector. And I'm so proud to lead the International Chamber of Commerce, which is able and capable and actually actually is the voice of the real economy in these sorts of discussions. I want to parse my remarks today. I want to talk a little bit about supply chains and value chains. I then want to talk about the investment climate. And I also then want to talk about economic governance. I'm probably a little bit more optimistic than some of the speakers today, even dear Rebecca. And maybe that's just because I come from the private sector. In the private sector, who wants to be in business with anyone who doesn't actually have an optimistic frame of mind? In the end, you want to do business with people who want to get things done. And one of the things that I noticed when we talk about supply chains is we do talk a lot about fragility, and I fully understand that. And we do understand that the COVID-19 has put massive pressure on global value chains. And in the early days of the pandemic, shortages were real and were painful. Supply chains, depending particularly on single sources or on single locations for medical equipment, parts and raw materials, suddenly appeared more fragile than ever. Many companies face fluctuating supply and demand dynamics, rapidly changing purchasing patterns, and a flurry of uncoordinated government measures. And I'll come back to that, I think, in a minute or two. And so there was quite naturally a perception created that supply chains were almost at breaking point. But ultimately, supply chains bent. They didn't break. Many companies quickly pivoted to provide essential goods and services in support of public health efforts. Alcohol companies produced hand sanitizers, textile manufacturers made masks, and hotels became quarantine centers. The ingenuity of the private sector can never be underestimated. Express delivery services ensured door-to-door supply of essential goods such as equipment, medicine, and food at the height of the crisis. And they did this while working from home during the greatest economic shock in a century. This actually, for me, suggests more robustness than fragility. And I am framing my remarks in that more optimistic lens. It's important to recognize, amidst panicked calls for reshoring and regionalizing that would only undercut competitiveness, these will also raise consumer prices and render entire industries more vulnerable to smaller, more localized shocks. Think about that. That companies acting largely in their own self-interest, in the interests of their clients and in the interests of their communities, managed to keep trade flowing. That's what actually happened. They increased visibility of the whole supply chain, they diversified sources of supply, they rebalanced stock levels, and they adopted strategies that responded to rapidly shifting consumer demand. As I said, the ingenuity of the private sector should never be underestimated. And so the message I would like to leave with you is that achieving systemic resilience can only occur if businesses are given the freedom to respond to the new situation and thoughtfully manage their own risks. Knee-jerk interventions by governments have actually been at the heart of the problems we've had in disruption of supply chains. That's not to diminish, of course, the strains that have emerged in recent months, particularly in global value chains. Many businesses in the very expansive ICC network, and as many of you know, we're in more than 150 countries. We have more than, actually, this year we now have something almost like 50 million businesses who are part of us. Many businesses in our network have actually suffered production outages or sales shortfalls due to disruptions in supply. Rising transport costs risk further stoking inflationary pressures in advanced economies in particular. And this will translate into punitive cost of living increases for hard-pressed families. We know that, we see that. There's no doubt that businesses will need to rethink the predominant model of just-in-time supply. That's one aspect, I think, of supply chains that really has been exposed as more fragile than others. And they'll need to do that to boost the resilience of their operations and businesses. And businesses and governments will together need to face up to these investments needed to boost shipping capacity over the medium term. I think we've all seen the dramatic rise in shipping costs over the last little while and the impact that's having on business, on communities, on the ability of elements of the business community to be competitive as well. So in short, we actually need supply networks to learn the real lessons of this crisis and find a new normal. But the real answers will not be found in the shimmer of reshoring, which in reality is nothing more than a form of populist protectionism, and that's how it's playing. I want to talk a little bit about investment. I have obviously direct involvement in supply chains as a business person, but also investment. I actually sit on the board of one of the largest investment companies that operates out of Australia. It's pension funds. We have about 180 billion funds under management. We invest very heavily in infrastructure. So I have a particular interest in this area. So while trade has largely rebounded, I did hear there was sort of the negative numbers that Rebecca pointed to, but I think as Rebecca would agree that the actual recovery in trade is actually happening as we speak. And that's certainly recovered since the depths of the economic shock in mid-2020. The investment picture is actually much more worrying, and I know and I hear the words of the Minister of Industry from Uganda, and I deeply respect those as well. The crucial question is not just how to increase investment, but how to get the right investment that will enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I shout out, by the way, I've just joined the advisory board of the African Infrastructure Green Investment Bank, because they're looking at how they do this. Because the reality is that around 6.3 trillion of infrastructure investment is needed each year to 2030 to actually meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And around 6.9 trillion is just needed to actually increase what is required to actually deliver on the infrastructure opportunities we have as well. So a significant portion of this will have to come from the private sector. Just a fact. Be it companies, financial institutions, banks, or long-term investors like the pension funds that I represent in the investment vehicle that I am on the governing board of. And they're all different forms of capital and require, in a sense, different understanding as well. We see from time to time public officials fail to understand the different forms of capital. But that's probably for another day to talk about how we align policies to represent what's needed by these different forms of capital, because what is required from pension funds is very different from what's required from private equity funds. We're long-term players. We love the assets. We actually like the macroeconomic settings. That's what we really look at. So we must ask, how do we create the right incentives for the private sector? And I'm saying we do need to understand there are different forms of capital. And we need to understand that and enable that so that we can shift the funds into the sort of investments we need to help us meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And I do shout out to the way in which Germany thinks this through. And I do shout out to the way in which UNCTAD sees this as a driving issue. And I do want to work more closely with UNCTAD. But my friends, I really want to work as closely as I can with developing countries on this, because I think, as Rebecca said, and as the Minister has said, we really need to get that right, to untap the value of Africa, which is actually presented to us all, so that it can actually enable its citizens to improve the lives they have. That's what we want to do. That's in our interest. The ICC, our purpose is to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. And that's what we do. Above all, we want to help governments get the investment right, which for business means doing it in a predictable, transparent, and efficient manner as they seek to assess and mitigate their risk when investing abroad. That's what we want as business people. And we actually have published at ICC investment guidelines, and I appreciate the fact that many governments and investors have picked those up. But we will redouble and we will reconsider those in the context of 2021 and where we are moving into 2022. And particularly, we'll take these into the next round of the G20 and B20. I'm actually in Rome at the moment for the B20, the Italian G20, but we'll be heavily involved in looking at this issue in the G20 under Indonesia as well. We encourage all governments to adopt sensible principles built around predictability, transparency, and efficiency. This is critical for investors to understand. And this is critical for governments to be able to show that they're doing. But in our post-2016 world, there's also more that can be done. We need to support the development of ESG and impact investing through truly global harmonized regulations. But make no mistake, impact investing will only get us so far. We need to ensure the whole of the financial system is actually aligned to deliver on the SDG principles. But we need to have harmonized regulations, metrics, and reporting models as well to enable an appropriate framework to exist to allow these funds to flow. We want to bend the financial world to support the investment in the SDGs and investment in Paris. We need to see governments, we need to help governments see the healthcare funding, and especially global emergency responses to the pandemic, epitomized by the ACT Accelerator and COVAX, which I actually sit on the board of. And I do shout out again to the Minister from Uganda. We do know the specific issues that confront Uganda in access to not just vaccines, but access to some of the support required, the support required to actually enable people to be treated. We actually created at the ICC a war room for Uganda around access to ventilators. That was the sort of thing that was being held up. That's the sort of thing that needed to be considered. Those are the sort of things that need to be delivered. You cannot actually get economic growth back to the pattern we want until we ensure the whole world is vaccinated. And we argue that case everywhere we go. And we are very grateful for the support of Uganda. We're very grateful for the support of Germany, particularly when we took this push to the G20, and we think it's very important as well. That's how you get a sustainable recovery. And we need governments to improve the attractiveness, by the way, of sustainable investment projects and bring in the private sector. That's why I'm so happy to be in this discussion where the private sector's voice is actually sought and actually listened to. And I just hope it will be acted upon as well. But that's really for the hand-to-hand that we need to conduct on a continuing basis. Let me talk finally about economic governance. Trade and investment ministers and ministries not only must get their domestic policy settings right through open economic settings that we always argue for, and government spending aligned and with a clear eye to the long term, but they must also tend more to the multilateral trading system in which we all operate. For too long, governments have actually taken trade rules with the WTO at its centre for granted. Governments have talked about the need for reform, but done little about it. Ministers have professed commitment to the system, but shied away from making any compromises or concessions that enable agreement. In fact, they actually blame the Secretariat of the WTO when things do not go the way they want them to go, when they cannot actually have the success that they want to trumpet. They blame the Secretariat. They're blaming Dr. Ngozi for what may be an outcome at the MC12, which may be underwhelming. But the fact of the matter is ministers are responsible for that. Ministers should be held accountable for that. Ministers must not only talk the need for reform, but must deliver on reform. And as a result, now 2 months out from the next WTO ministerial MC12, the world looks set to simply roll over today's problems with the world trading system into tomorrow's problems. And that is just not good enough from a business perspective. Business looks at this and says this is just not good enough. And the WTO and its ability to write rules and adjudicate disputes, these matter deeply to global business. Market access matters to us. It really does. Rules to enable trade facilitation really matters to us. It really does. Ensuring that we've got a functioning digital platform to enable the 21st century economic model to progress and benefit Africa and benefit Latin America and Asia and elsewhere really matters to business. And it matters to the ICC. Almost 70% of the ICC is based in developing and emerging economies. So these things matter to us. So we don't look at this and actually agree that we can just kick it down the road. That's not what we want. And if we do not actually get on top of this, the WTO will continue to ossify and become irrelevant. What is so pleasing about the engagement of Dr. Ngozi is she is determined to enable an agenda, which is the 21st agenda, grappling with health issues, grappling with technology and the digital platform, grappling with issues to do with the operating model for the WTO, and that is very good. And let me be very clear that if MC12 does not move forward and deliver the results that's expected, we do not see Dr. Ngozi as responsible. We see the trade ministers as responsible and the governments as responsible. And that's how we're talking about that. However, I'm an optimist, and I actually do genuinely believe there is room there to actually close off a number of issues which can actually propel the WTO into relevance in the 21st century. I can tell you one thing, certainly got a Director General who's got the energy to actually push the organisation as hard as she can, but it will not be on her shoulders alone that this should rest. So in conclusion, the fortunes of business and their employees the world over, and let's not forget, when I talk about the number of companies that are part of the ICC, almost 55 million, more than 1.5 billion workers in the world rely upon the success of those businesses for their livelihoods. We never forget that. We don't want you to forget that. We don't want governments to forget that. We want to make certain that the environment which is necessary for businesses to be successful is actually put in place. And part of that environment is ensuring that businesses can export and trade, and the countries can attract investment to allow those SMEs, allow the real economy to really flourish and prosper. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, John Denton, the optimist, for that barnstormer of a speech. Now, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't received very many questions from you yet. Let me just remind you of how you can contact us. You can use the chat function on our platform, or you can email us direct to the Secretariat, and that is diae.info@un.org, diae.info@un.org. So please do join in this conversation. I've got only one or two questions so far. So while we're waiting for the questions to flow in, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Rebecca Greenspan, who was listening so keenly to these early interventions, and ask her for her responses. Ms. Greenspan.
Thank you so much. No, I want to thank the panelists because each of them gave like a different perspective of the same problem. And I think that that's in a way what we should do, yes, to bring all the stakeholders, you know, to have this dialogue and this conversation. So to the Minister of Uganda, I share with him the concerns and also the opportunities that he laid out. With our dear friends from Germany, really thank you very much, because I think that you are doing a lot on these issues, and the stand of Germany is very important to send a signal, yes, to the rest of the world. And I think that that is true on the vaccines issue, on trade, and for sure on investment for sustainable development. And dear John, thank you very much for your intervention. You know that I am basically an optimist too. And I really think it's interesting that many times, and we have talked about this before, that many times the private sector is more optimistic than the analyst. And I think that this is very good, yes, because they have the boots on the ground, and they are the ones that can make a lot of the changes that we are seeing. But my only problem, John, maybe, is that I really think that the leveraging the private sector to a more inclusive development for all will need also public money to come with it. And I am not seeing the numbers that we will need for that to happen, yes, yet. Because the public sector will have to invest in infrastructure, will have to invest in diversification and productive capacity, will have to invest in education and health, and will have to reverse the very severe impacts of this pandemic. And although I think that Kristalina Georgieva has been a wonderful leader in the IMF, and the SDR's emission is a very good sign, and also the debt framework of the G20, I still think that this is too little for the needs of the developing world. So the only thing that I want to say is that no doubt we need to leverage the private sector ingenuity and investment in the developing world, but we will need more financing for development. So to make possible that the small island states, that the low-income countries, that the very badly hit middle-income countries will be able to put themselves again, you know, in the long road for sustainable development. And maybe that has been part of this whole exercise with UNCTAD 15, how to close the asymmetries, how to close the gaps that still affect the developing world, so they can take the best advantage of private investment, but of trade for development. And I think that still the balance that we need for that to happen is not there.
Thank you so much, Ms. Greenspan. Well, questions are beginning to trickle in now, and they're clearly listening to you, ladies and gentlemen, very clearly, because this is what our first question is. I think I'm going to put it to Your Excellency, Mr. David Bahati from Uganda. And the question is, how can FDI flows, foreign direct investment flows, be channeled effectively towards the SDGs? What are the opportunities and challenges do you think your country faces in this regard?
Yeah, thank you very much. As I've said, there are quite a number of opportunities in our country in terms of agro-processing, in terms of minerals, in terms of tourism. And to do this, we must reduce the cost of doing business. Namely, we must reduce the cost of electricity. We now have taken a policy that we build 22 industrial parks, and to reduce the cost of electricity, we want to ensure that the electricity, the power that goes into these industrial parks goes at a fixed price of 5 cents, so that investments that come into the country, industries that come into the country find the cost of electricity affordable. The second point is what actually the Secretary General has raised, and I think John also touched about it, the cost of capital. One of the challenges that we have in the country is that people who want to invest in manufacturing and other sectors find the cost of capital very, very, very high. And we have set up a bank specifically to handle that, the Uganda Development Bank, where we're putting in more resources to be able to bring down the cost of capital to help manufacturers and other areas. Then the cost of transport, which is infrastructure. We have invested heavily in terms of infrastructure to develop the oil and gas industry. Over 1.5 billion has been put in place to develop the international hospital to facilitate the logistics of the oil and gas industry, and also the road network in terms of in the area where our oil is going to be tapped. But we still have a challenge of raw materials in the context of COVID, because most of the raw materials to facilitate manufacturing has been coming from China and other areas. And because of COVID, there was a lot of disruption. So that's another area that we are addressing. But in terms of opportunities, there are massive opportunities, not only in Uganda, but also on the continent. And the government is doing all it can to ensure that there is a conducive environment to help investments flow into the country. And there can never be any improvement on the climate change of investment than having peace and stability in the country. And we see our country, Uganda, being a beacon of hope in terms of peace and security on the continent. And I think that, in my opinion, would attract many investments in the country and on the continent if we stabilize the security and peace on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I sincerely hope so. I'd like to put that same question about how to make FDIs more focused on delivering the SDG goals to Mr. Denton. It came in from the audience, but I'd like to tack on my own question, if I may, to it, Mr. Denton, because of a point you made earlier in your opening remarks. You said governments need to be made, sorry, let me see what I've written down here. Yes, governments need to make sustainable investment more attractive, you said. That's one of the keys to unlocking this. So could you use that as your lever to answer the question from the audience, please?
Two things, if I could. First of all, another reason why I'm so glad that Rebecca Greenspan is leading the UNCTAD is that the very issue you pointed to, Rebecca, around access to finance, access through SDRs, access to additional support for developing countries is exactly what we have been focusing on. We have worked very closely with an unusual group I suppose I call it an unusual coalition with the international trade union movement, with civil society, to push the case at the IMF World Bank meetings that the allocation, by the way, of SDRs that was made, first of all, we insisted that it be made, but also that it is insufficient. It is actually insufficient. And we know there's politics as to why there's a particular threshold that can't be crossed because of the need then for one of the members to actually seek political approval for that. But that's not to stop them going back, as we would say. So it's really important. And also we know that a number of economies were actually struggling to actually have access to the liquidity they needed because they didn't qualify, because they were middle income economies, and these are in Latin America. And so we've worked very hard to try and ease that. And I think it's really important. I'm going to the specific question about attractiveness of FDI and incentives. I just want to be a realist here, an optimistic realist as well. Investment in infrastructure, foreign direct investment is not a charity. You want investors who have to weigh up different commercial opportunities to decide to invest. How do you make it attractive? What are the incentives? How do you ensure that the return they get from investing in sustainable development, the investing in ESG related projects is as attractive as other opportunities that are before them? And for me, that actually requires some thinking around the frameworks around investment, ratings agencies. For example, it's why getting agreement at COP26 on Article 6 is so important. If we don't get a way of actually pricing the externalities around carbon, then the idea that somehow there's enough impact investing funds and philanthropic funds in the world to help us get to the Paris outcomes is just delusional. A $10 trillion cost. You're actually going to have to find a way of enabling the financial markets to bend to support that. And the way of doing that is actually not asking them to make a charitable donation. It's by saying to them, here is an investable proposition. Here is the way in which offsets will work in terms of the carbon market, etc. That's what we have to do. So by the way, I mean, we haven't really talked about COP26. Again, COP26 is critical. Having seen how in Madrid at COP25, the member states kicked that issue down the road, they cannot be allowed to do it again at COP26 when you actually look at the outputs that are available to us about the challenges for the planet, that unless we actually get an incentivized financial market to support investment in projects that will lead to improved action on climate, we're not going to get there. We're just not going to get there. So these are critical issues, but signals are important. Ensuring that markets function appropriately and are aligned to the outcomes are really key as well. The other thing I'll just simply say, there's no actual ratings agency focused on SDGs. The SDGs are too hard to rate in terms of risk, which is why they moved to ESG. And ESG is actually, it's actually more susceptible to effective rating. But I don't know if you've noticed it, but there's a plethora of different ratings on the same subjects for ESG globally. One of the things we're trying to do at the ICC is to get a common taxonomy around this, a common framework. Because at the moment, if I'm a company, I can have something like 65 different ratings of me on ESG, and none of them align. So we actually want to get some commonality there, and that's a piece of work that a lot of people are actually engaged with, but we need to have that, as well as the market signals sorted out on Article 6. And then we also need to sort, by the way, on Paris, that the developed world needs to live up to its promise to the developing world to provide the 100 billion. 80 billion is not 100 billion, there's 20 billion. Where is it? It needs to be on the table at COP26.
Indeed, John, thank you very much. Interesting point you were making about the importance of signals to make sure that the private sector really has incentives to invest. And that quite nicely links into the next question that's come in. Thank you very much to whoever has sent it. It's about what are likely to be the impacts of the big COVID pandemic recovery plans that we're seeing on the broader investment landscape, because recovery spending and any kind of major expenditure of that sort is bound to tilt profitability and the risk assessment of the investment community. It distorts the landscape effectively. So what do you think the effects are likely to be, and how might that hamper or support the rebuilding and reshaping of value chains is the question. And I think I'd like to put that to Your Excellency, the Vice Minister from Germany.
Yes, I think the sheer size of recovery packages rolled out all over the world will top 3.5 trillion, with an estimated additional private follow-on investment of $6.5 trillion. There's no question that such an amount of money, especially if it is unevenly spent, will impact global investment patterns. On the one hand, these rescue packages will boost investments in the SDGs, as they are mostly targeting SDG sectors and industries. However, most of this money is geared towards spending in developed countries and a few emerging markets, and hence will do little to fill the annual developing country SDGs investment gap that was estimated by UNCTAD at around $2.3 trillion per year up until 2030. Indeed, developing countries account for only about 10% of total recovery spending plans to date. The massive size of these packages, however, will almost certainly lead to spillover effects in most parts of the world and thereby have an indirect risk. On the other hand, the magnitude of these spending plans will have a notable impact on international project finance and international investment flows. There's a risk that these might move away from the developing world towards lower risk and lower impact projects that are mostly located in industrialized economies. In order to avoid development financing difficulties in developing countries, we will thus need to shield investment that is not geared towards infrastructure sectors from the sucking effects of these enormous spending plans. This requires promotion of investment in industries that are central to growth in productive capacity. And this requires that countries improve rapidly and vastly their implementation and absorptive capacities to make the most use of foreign investment, and that they strengthen their governance and contracts to ensure adequate social and environmental standards.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. John Denton, could I put the same point to you?
Apologies, I keep on meaning to take myself off mute. Two things I'd say just in terms of quality of investments in the post or in the context of COVID.
John, I think you switched your camera off inadvertently. We can hear you, but we can't see you, and it would be lovely to see you.
Well, you're lucky you can't see me. But we actually reviewed the first tranche of major government investments and the way in which governments applied their recovery funds. In the immediate moments post the realization that this was a real economy shock. And what was really interesting for us with the billions and billions, in some cases trillions of dollars in cumulative amount, was how little actually went into aligned stimulus along SDG and ESG principles, even along Paris principles. And we actually unpicked that, and this is the first tranche. The second tranche, I have to say, was better, but a number of us got heavily involved, particularly in the private sector. This is just a bad outcome. And that's because a lot of finance ministries have not bought into the politics, the positive politics of climate action on climate change and action on SDGs. And this is an issue. We're talking to the wrong people sometimes. We actually need to be talking to the finance ministries. And it's not even the finance ministers, because what actually happens is that often finance ministers are reluctant to question the policy positions that come forward from their finance ministries. And those finance ministries are still schooled in a way of thinking about the future which does not factor in the importance of bringing ESG and climate change, action on climate change, into their deliberations. So we saw it. You would have seen the number of what's called shovel-ready projects, which were not aligned to the SDGs, but were seen as practical solutions for governments to deliver there and then. And of course, what they did was they exacerbated some of the challenge we were seeing rather than improving. It was only the second tranche after the private sector and I think a number of other players got involved and argued the need for these to be much more aligned to the long-term investment required to support action on the SDGs and actions on ESG. So there's a lesson, I think, for all of us there. That politicians actually need, when they say things, to ensure that the policy advice they get is aligned to that. And the finance ministries in particular, who generally control access to budgetary funds, actually understand what is required for the future and are not working out of a playbook which was relevant in 2001, which is what many of them were doing. They were actually recutting the COVID crisis as a financial markets crisis, failing to understand it was a real economy crisis. The other thing I think which is really critical thinking about investments now, and investments which will support the future, and it goes back to a powerful intervention by the Minister of State from Uganda. If we don't completely fund COVAX to enable the global world to be vaccinated, then we have made not just a mistake in terms of economic development, we have made a mistake in terms of social progress as well. If we're not able to stand up and say that we have given the opportunity to the global world to be vaccinated so they can participate in the global economy, we will be exacerbating inequality, but more importantly, we'll be cutting our own noses off to spite our faces, because what we have said was it's only by doing so, by ensuring that the global world is vaccinated, that we will avoid what we see now as a potential multi-trillion-dollar hole that is emerging, because the failure to understand the interconnectedness of supply chains, the interconnectedness of production. If some economies cannot produce because they're still in lockdown, or new forms of mutation of the virus emerges, then that actually doesn't hurt just the developing world, that hurts the developed world. And we're seeing that now, particularly in the construction industry. In the UK, for example, you're seeing that now with issues around semiconductors as well. There's a $9.2 trillion hit to the global economy if we don't do this right, if we don't actually behave as we should. There's a consequence to that, and about 50% of that falls on developed countries. So it's actually really in everyone's economic interest to get that done, and the gap that needs to be not so big. Thank you.
It seems extraordinary, doesn't it, that a health equity issue like providing vaccines for the world and properly funding COVAX is not seen in the context of the interconnectivity of the whole world at every level. Thank you very much, John. An interesting question has come in for you, Honourable Minister Bahati from Uganda, and it's really picking up on something that Rebecca Grinspan said in her opening remarks about the opportunities from the regionalization of supply chains and value chains. And it's really about asking you whether you see opportunities for Uganda and the region from the implementation of the African Continent Free Trade Agreement, particularly useful, I would have imagined, for a landlocked developing country like Uganda. What are your thoughts, Minister?
Thank you very much. To begin with, the GDP of the African continent is close now to 3.4 trillion, and with a population of over 1 billion in the next few years. So the African Free Trade Area is an important market, not only for Uganda, but for all countries on the continent. And we are working out a mechanism to make sure that we remove all the restrictions in place to be able to access this market amongst ourselves. So it's a major and massive opportunity for our country and for the continent to exploit this and utilize this human resource of 1 billion, which is a huge market. And I think it will also help support other economies like the European Union and the American Union, because the production, combined production of the continent will actually now address the issue, some of the issues that we have been challenged with. For example, the country gets a market in Europe or in America under AGOA. Just to give an example, we are supposed to have 6,400 duty-free commodities exported to the Americans, but because of the constraints of production, we cannot now satisfy that market. But if we work together as African Free Trade Area, it will help us to also address the supply side constraints, at the same time provide the market on the other side. So it's a very, very important market for us. It's an important opportunity for the continent, and also give us the capacity to negotiate more with other countries from other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Questions come in for you, Honourable Minister from Germany, Ms. Elisabeth Winkelmeyer-Becker. I think you said in your opening statement, you were talking about German investment guarantees and how that's been an important prong of German trade support. And the question that's come in is basically about what impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on your investment guarantees. How is that unfolding now?
Yes, thank you for your question. The pandemic caused a slump in demand for investment guarantees. Last year, guarantees totally roughly for 0.9 billion were provided, 2/3 down from the 2019 level. However, the current trend is clearly pointing upwards. In the first half of 2021, the total volume of new guarantees already amounted to 1.8 billion euro. The number of inquiries about guarantees is also much higher than it was last year. These are clear signs of a recovery. They show that German firms are continuing to invest substantial amounts in developing and emerging economies.
That's very good to hear, and that it's on an upward trend indeed. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. John, I wonder if I could ask you to draw together some of the questions that we're hearing. So many of them are related to businesses and how they're going to react. You expressed quite a lot of skepticism at the beginning about reshoring. I wrote down shimmer of reshoring, which sounds like a very skeptical point indeed. Could you unpack that a bit more? I'm curious to find out why you are skeptical about something which so many people seem to be, really caught up in, the need to draw in and shorten value chains.
Well, I'm just a shimmer I talked about. I'm just fundamentally practical. You look at the amount of funds that, for example, a G7 economy like Japan made available for reshoring. Look at the take-up. It just hasn't been taken up. Why is that? It's not because money's not on offer to do it. It's because it's impractical and it doesn't make economic sense for businesses to do. I am actually ultimately practical. People will do what's in their best interest, and the best interest of companies is in the best interest of their clients. And what you're seeing is even when governments dangle money in front of them, they're actually not prepared to do it because it doesn't make economic sense, it doesn't make business sense.
So as our conversation is drawing to a conclusion, I'm going to ask each one of you in turn to give me one thought, one positive practical thing that you think we should be focusing on and getting UNCTAD to focus on. Do you remember Rebecca Greenspan said at the beginning, lay down an agenda for us that you think would be important to make sure that all these changes that we're seeing, these important changes and questions that are afoot, actually deliver what we want them to deliver in terms of the SDGs. So one practical point, please. Focus your minds, dear panelists, and I'm going to ask first Your Excellency David Bahati.
I think in the situation we are in the context of COVID, we must really resolve the issue of access to vaccines, because what is immediate for us now, we can better trade investments if we solve this issue of COVID. And therefore, less developed countries allow us to set up factories here that can produce vaccines so that we solve these problems of COVID as soon as possible, so that we return to normal, to start now talking about issues of trade, issues of investment, and other issues that affect the economy and trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I suspect John Denton would wholly agree with that comment, but I'm going to ask you to leave us with a separate end thought, one practical suggestion that you think that UNCTAD, indeed all of us, should be focusing on at this point.
I think UNCTAD and its, I suppose, objectives can only be achieved with effective public-private partnership. And what that means is that, Secretary-General, you need to treat the private sector as a partner, and that requires collaboration. And effective collaboration is where you put your interests at the same level as our interests. And what that means is people have got to stop seeing the private sector as just a piggy bank here. They have to be absolutely involved in creating an understanding of what the real problems are to be dealt with, and then what the solutions should look like. We do that at the moment with trade facilitation, where we've launched this amazing campaign where what we do is we bring together development agencies and the private sectors and governments in Africa, for example, and elsewhere, where we identify what real problems are terms of getting goods across borders. We then crowd in the private sector with solutions and the development agencies to work together with through us to enable an effective collaboration. That model works. That model actually has results, and I'd love to see that model applied with work with UNCTAD.
Dear panelists, thank you very much for your practical and aspirational contributions. And with that, we are going to bring to a close this second Ministerial Roundtable at UNCTAD 15. May I draw your attention to our next roundtable coming up in about 45 minutes' time, and that is going to focus on regional integration for a resilient, inclusive and sustainable future at the top of the hour. And of course, let me remind you that the World Investment Forum is going to be held between 18th and 22nd of October, and we will be gathering together some of the discussions we've had through these ministerial roundtables to feed into the WIF. It's been a pleasure being your moderator today. From me, Nisha Pillay. Goodbye.